Okay, I want you to just close your eyes for a second and try to picture London, but not today's London. Think 350 years ago, no glass towers, no steel, it's all wood, pitch, maybe some straw, and then just chaos. Absolute firestorm.
Yeah.
We're taking a deep dive today into the Great Fire of London. It's, well, arguably the single most catastrophic fire Britain's ever seen.
Oh, absolutely. And it really wasn't just, a big fire. It felt almost inevitable looking back. You had centuries of medieval building styles, this really long drought, and just general negligence, really, all colliding.
And the scale, it's hard to wrap your head around. What are the numbers again?
We're talking 87 parish churches just gone, over 13,000 houses burnt to the ground. Historians have tried to put a modern price tag on it, and the estimates float around $37 billion.
37 billion. That's, well, it's almost meaningless, isn't it? Especially when you think back then there was no insurance payout waiting, no, fire department rolling up with hoses, no coordinated government response, not at first anyway.
Right.
So our mission today, what we want to do is really walk the path of this fire, almost hour by hour. We want to pinpoint exactly where that first spark happened, understand why it spread so terrifyingly fast, and maybe most importantly, uncover the loss, the survival.
Right. And to do that, we've picked 3 Londoners from the time. Their stories sort of anchor everything. They show how this fire didn't care if you were rich or poor. It hit everyone. It gives us a real cross-section of society.
Okay, so who are they? Let's start maybe at the lower end.
Okay, so first we have Sybil Tame. She was a shoemaker, a single mother, lived and worked at a place called Christ Hospital. For her, everything, her whole livelihood was tied up in her tools, her little workshop. Lose those and, well, how do you...
Right, the immediate survival. Okay, moving up.
Next, there's Joshua Curt. He was doing pretty well for himself. A bookseller, had a shop near St. Paul's Cathedral. Now, for him, his wealth was his stock. Thousands of books, prints, parchment, all incredibly flammable stuff. The fire wasn't just a threat to his house, it threatened the very core of his business.
Okay, but got it. And at the top?
At the very top, we meet Robert Viner. This guy was serious. A goldsmith, but really more of a banker, on Lombard Street, which is like the Wall Street of its day. And get this, he was the main banker for King Charles II himself.
Wow, okay. So connected right to the top.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Viner's story is crucial because it shows that even having tons of money in the king's ear, well, it wasn't necessarily enough when faced with this kind of disaster. And maybe more pointedly, with the king's later...
Intriguing. Okay, let's dive into section 1, the start of it all. So let's set the scene. Where and when does this night...
It all kicks off late on Saturday, September 1st, 1666. And the sources are really clear on this. It was the tail end of an exceptionally long, hot, dry summer. London was just brittle. Wood everywhere, dried out. The air itself felt, ready to catch fire.
A tinderbox, basically.
Exactly. And crucially, this wasn't a fire that started like midday when everyone's about. It sparks up in the dead of night, which takes us to Pudding Lane.
Pudding Lane. Even the name sounds quaintly medieval. Why Pudding Lane?
Well, it's not about dessert. It actually came from the butchers nearby. They used to dump the animal guts and offal, what they called pudding back then, into the lane or nearby ditches. Grim, huh?
Ugh, yeah. Definitely. Okay, so Pudding Lane and the specific place...
Thomas Farriner's Bakery. Now, for centuries, people just said Farriner's Bakery. But some really fascinating recent historical digging comparing old city plans with modern maps has pinpointed it much more precisely.
Oh, really? Where exactly?
Yeah. So his shopfront was on Pudding Lane, but the actual spark, the ignition point, it looks like it was in the little yard at the back of his house. An area that today is actually part of Monument Street. So it wasn't inside the main bakery oven area initially.
Okay, the backyard. And what was the fuel? What actually caught fire, not just like flour dust?
It was something called bavins. These were basically bundles of brushwood, twigs, that kind of thing. Really dry. They were used as fuel for the oven, and they were stacked right there in the yard, probably near the oven structure itself.
Ah, okay. So a stray ember.
Exactly. Maybe from the oven earlier, or perhaps a spark carried by the wind, which had been blowing quite strong. It just takes one tiny ember landing in that dry brushwood, and it starts to smolder quietly.
And the Farriner family. They must have been asked about this endlessly.
Oh, endlessly. Thomas Farriner and his family always swore, absolutely insisted, that the oven fire was definitely out. His daughter Hannah checked around midnight, apparently. But, you can see why they'd say that. Nobody wants to be the guy who burned down London.
No kidding. So the fire starts smoldering maybe around midnight, maybe a bit later?
Right. Sometime between midnight and maybe 2 a.m. on Sunday morning. It really takes hold. Farriner, his daughter, and his son managed to escape. They had to scramble out of an upstairs window and crawl across the roof to the next house.
Wow, but not everyone.
Tragically, no. The family had a maidservant. We don't even know her name. The smoke must have filled the house incredibly quick. She apparently tried to get out via the main staircase, but was overcome. She became the fire's first known victim.
Awful. So that's the spark, the initial tragedy. But how does one small fire in a backyard become this city-eating monster? We need to talk about London itself, right? The buildings.
Absolutely. The architecture was a huge, huge factor. The key thing to understand is a technique called jettying. You've probably seen drawings or reconstructions of old medieval streets.
Yeah, where the upper floors kind of stick out further than the ground floor.
Exactly. Each story jutted out over the one below. It was a way to get more living space upstairs without making the narrow streets even narrower at ground level. Smart in one way, but terrible for fire safety.
Why terrible?
Because think about it. On these narrow lanes, the top floors of houses on opposite sides could be incredibly close. People literally said you could almost shake hands across the street from your attic window.
Right. So the fire
could just leap across that gap. Once it got up to the roof level, it didn't need to burn its way down and across the street. It could just jump from jetty to jetty, roof to roof, creating this terrifying, continuous wave of flames high above the street level, a canopy of fire.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about the materials? Everyone thinks of old London built of like wattle and daub. That sounds flimsy and flammable.
It does. And that's a common idea, but the reality is a bit more complex. Modern tests have actually been done on wattle and daub. That's the woven wood lattice packed with a mud mixture, or daub.
And super flammable.
Surprisingly, no, not if it's well maintained. Properly constructed and plastered wattle and daub can actually achieve a pretty high fire resistance rating, Class 1 even. The mud layer acts as a decent insulator, protecting the timber frame underneath.
So the material itself wasn't necessarily the problem?
Not inherently, no. The real problem was maintenance and, frankly, poverty. For decades, the city authorities had tried to get people to build with brick and stone, but timber was cheaper and fast. Especially in the poorer, more crowded areas, houses were often old, dilapidated.
Meaning the protective plaster was?
Crumbling. Exactly. It fell off, exposing the old, dry, sometimes rotten wooden timbers of the frame and the woven wattle itself. That exposed tinder-dry wood that was incredibly flammable. So it wasn't the wattle and daub itself, but the neglect and decay that turned the city into fuel.
Okay, so dry weather, flammable structures, close-packed buildings. What about the initial response? Did anyone raise the alarm quickly?
The first real sign from most people nearby would have been the church bell, suddenly, frantically ringing. Specifically, the bells of St. Magnus the Martyr, which was just down the street from Pudding Lane.
The irony.
The warden of St. Magnus the Martyr, Thomas Farriner, the baker.
You couldn't make it up, so the bells are ringing. Surely someone in charge steps in. The mayor.
Ah, Mayor Thomas Bloodworth. This is where leadership just fails spectacularly. He was woken up, told about the fire. He was the only person with the authority to order the drastic action needed, pulling down houses to create firebreaks, stop the fire's fuel source.
Makes sense. Did he do it?
No, he refused, flat out. Apparently, he was worried about the cost and the political fallout. Many of the properties in the fire's path belonged to wealthy merchants, his supporters. He didn't want to authorize destroying their valuable buildings.
Politics over safe.
Completely. And he massively underestimated the danger. He went to see the fire and famously, dismissively, said something like, "Pish, a woman could piss it out."
Oh, come on. Really?
That's the quote that's gone down in history. That arrogance, the failure to grasp the situation, basically sealed London's fate in those early hours. By the time anyone with real power, like King Charles II, finally overruled him and started ordering demolitions, it was far, far too late. The fire was already out of control.
It's just incredible, that lack of imagination or maybe willingness to see the danger, believing the small fire couldn't possibly become, well, what it became.
Exactly. Complacency killed the city as much as the flames did.
And that complacency continued, didn't it? Even into Sunday morning. You mentioned Samuel Pepys earlier.
Yeah, the famous diarist. His account is so valuable. Around 3:20 a.m. Sunday, the fire is really starting to get going near the river. His maid wakes him up. He gets up, takes a look out the window.
Chin freaks out.
Nope. Decides it looks pretty far off, not too bad, and goes back to bed.
Serious.
It shows how people just couldn't comprehend the scale yet. London had fires, sure, but they were usually contained. This mindset, this sort of "it won't reach me" attitude, was widespread in those first few hours.
Until it very definitely did reach them. What was the next big turning?
That happened around 4 a.m. Sunday when the fire hit the warehouses down by the Thames. This is where it transitions from a bad neighborhood fire into an absolute monster. This area was basically an explosion zone waiting to happen.
Why were the warehouses so bad? Lots of wood.
Lots of wood, yes, big structure. But it was what was inside. They were crammed full of highly flammable goods. Huge quantities of paper, bales of hay, timber, spirits like brandy, oil, and crucially, barrels and barrels of tar for shipbuilding and waterproof, pure fuel.
Okay, that sounds bad.
And this is where we see this terrifying phenomenon called flashover. Eyewitnesses reported seeing warehouses suddenly burst into flames before the actual fire even touched the building.
Hold on, how does that work? How can something catch fire just from heat without flames touching it?
It's about radiant heat. The fire outside is generating incredible temperatures. That heat radiates across the space, through the air, through the walls even. It heats up everything inside the warehouse incredibly quickly. So all those flammable materials, the tar, the oil, the paper, the wood, they start to get superheated. They begin to release flammable gases. This process is called pyrolysis. You get this layer of superheated, invisible, flammable gas building up under the ceiling.
Like a hidden gas bomb.
Pretty much. When the temperature of that gas layer reaches its auto-ignition point, which can be around 500, 600 degrees Celsius, sometimes lower, depending on the gas, the entire volume of gas ignites spontaneously, all at once.
Whoosh.
Exactly. A massive woof or poof. There have been demonstrations done, heating a barrel of tar. Eventually, the gases coming off it just ignite from the heat alone. That's flashover, or sometimes called rollover. Now, imagine that happening in dozens of warehouses packed tightly together, almost simultaneously. Explosive spread.
Terrifying. Okay, so by dawn Sunday, the fire is raging, warehouses are exploding. The denial must have vanished pretty quickly then.
Oh, yeah. Dawn Sunday is when sheer panic set because a frantic scramble for self-preservation. Any sense of community spirit just evaporates as every person for themselves.
What did that look like on the ground?
Chaos. People desperately trying to save their belongings, throwing furniture, bedding, whatever they could grab out into the streets. Many started flinging things into the Thames, hoping the water would save them, though much of it just floated away or sank. Churches, any stone building, became makeshift warehouse, crammed floor to ceiling with salvaged goods.
And the streets.
Absolute gridlock. Total nightmare. There was no evacuation plan, no organized way out, and worse, you had terrible exploitation happening.
How so?
The wealthy merchants, desperate to save their valuable goods, started hiring anyone with a cart, these canny carters or delivery men. But the demand was insane, so the prices went through the roof.
Like how much?
We're talking payments equivalent to maybe 30,000 pounds in today's money.
Yeah.
Just to haul one cartload of goods a few miles out of the city.
30 grand for a cart ride.
Yep. And the effect was disastrous. These huge, heavily laden carts belonging to the rich clogged every major road out of the city, which meant ordinary people, the poor who couldn't possibly afford those prices, often couldn't even get out with the few things they could carry. They were trapped by the wealthy saving their stuff.
Which brings us back to our wealthy banker, Robert Farriner. His street, Lombard Street, was the financial. Was he caught in this chaos?
Farriner was smarter, or perhaps just more caught. By Monday afternoon, the fire was clearly heading towards Lombard Street, but Farriner hadn't waited. He acted much earlier.
How much earlier?
About 24 hours ahead. He saw the way the wind was blowing, literally and figuratively. He's described as ever the cautious banker. He made a crucial decision.
Which was?
He prioritized his assets over his house. He knew he couldn't rely on getting carts through that mess later. So very early on, probably Sunday, he organized transport for the really valuable stuff. Business ledgers, huge amounts of jewelry and gold, and cash reserves.
Where did he send it? A country estate?
Even safer. He sent it about 20 miles away, straight to Windsor Castle. He put it under the direct protection of his friend and most important client, King Charles II.
Smart move.
Very smart. It saved his business assets, his financial instruments. He lost his magnificent house on Lombard Street. Everything in it went up in flames. But the core of his wealth cured, thanks to his foresight and royal connection.
But the financial district itself, what happened when the fire got?
It was devastating. The fire swept through Lombard Street, but the symbolic heart of the financial catastrophe was the destruction of the Royal Exchange.
The Royal Exchange. What exactly was that? Just like a stock market?
It was much more than that. Think of it as a massive, combined shopping mall, stock exchange, and business center, all rolled into one impressive building. Around 3,000 merchants had stalls or offices there, selling everything imaginable, from luxury cloth to spices, and conducting international trade.
So its destruction wasn't just symbolic, it was economically crippling.
Absolutely crippling. One historian described it as being like the Bank of England, the London Stock Exchange, and all the major banks burning down in a single afternoon. It was the engine of the English economy.
Is that where the story about this mall comes from?
Yes, that's a detail that really sticks with you. As the Royal Exchange burned, eyewitnesses reported this strange, pungent, almost exotic smell hanging in the air, stinging the back of their throats.
What was it?
Burning pepper. The East India Company stored massive quantities of valuable spices, especially pepper, in the stone crypt beneath the exchange. The heat got so intense it roasted tons of it. Imagine the smell of huge amounts of pepper burning.
That's bizarrely specific.
Isn't it? It really highlights how global London's trade was, even then. And the impact of losing the exchange was immediate and widespread. The rich merchants lost their capital, their investments, their lines of credit, but the ordinary people, they'd lost their jobs. Porters, clerks, shop assistants, dock workers. The whole system ground to a halt. It sent the entire economy into a nosedive.
Okay, so we're into Tuesday, day 3. The fire is just relentless. Where is it heading now?
It's pushing west and north. By dawn Tuesday, it hits Cheapside. This was London's equivalent of, Fifth Avenue or Regent Street today. The most fashionable high street, packed with expensive shops, goldsmiths, mercers, haberdashers.
And the fire itself, still raging.
Oh, yeah. Reports from the time say the wall of flames advancing on Cheapside was over 30 feet high. It was consuming something like 100 houses every single hour. Just unstoppable.
Unbelievable speed. Is this where the king steps up? You mentioned him earlier.
Exactly. This is where King Charles II really seized his moment. Remember, his reputation wasn't great. He actually fled London during the Great Plague the year before, which didn't endear him to his subject. People saw him as a bit detached, more interested in his courtly pleasures.
So the fire was a chance to fix that image?
A massive PR opportunity. And he knew it. He realized that just issuing orders wasn't enough. He needed to be seen to be involved. So he and his brother, the Duke of York, personally went down to the fire lines.
Really? Like getting their hands dirty?
Totally. There are accounts of them passing buckets of water, helping to operate the very basic fire engines they had, directing demolition crews, even paying people out of their own pockets to encourage them to work harder. They put themselves right there amongst the smoke and chaos.
That must have made a difference to morale.
A huge difference. Seeing the king and the duke working alongside them, sharing the danger, it really impressed people. It helped restore a lot of faith in the monarchy, made Charles seem like a leader who genuinely cared. A very calculated move, perhaps, but effective.
But even with the king there, the fire was still doing strange things right ahead.
Yes, that was one of the most terrifying aspects. The fire wasn't just spreading predictably from house to house. It was jumping, sometimes half a mile or more, starting new fires far ahead of the main blaze. This points to something we now understand better from studying modern wildfires.
Okay, what's the connection?
It's all about embers. This comes from research by fire scientists like Dr. Guillermo Rey. When a fire gets this big and intense, especially driven by strong winds, and remember, there was a gale blowing for 4 days straight. It doesn't just throw off sparks.
What's the difference between a spark and an ember?
A spark is just momentary heat, real. An ember is a small piece of burning material, a chunk of wood, thatch, whatever, that's still glowing and holding heat. These embers get lifted up by the convection column of the fire and carried long distances by the wind.
Like tiny firebombs being delivered by the gale?
Exactly. They're essentially carrying the fire miles away from its source. Dr. Rain actually did this fascinating experiment called the Imperial Dragon Test to show how this worked with London's roofs.
What did they do?
They built mock-ups of typical 17th century London roofs using clay tile. One roof was perfectly maintained, tiles all intact. They blew embers at it. The embers mostly just bounced off. The intact tiles did their job.
Okay, but the second roof?
The second roof simulated the reality in many parts of London, especially the poorer areas. It had cracked tiles, slip tiles, little gaps where wind and rain had taken their toll over the years.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Right. When they blew embers at that roof, the embers slipped through the cracks, landed on the dry wooden roof battens underneath the tiles, and within minutes, those battens were...
So the state of the housing was critical.
Absolutely critical. It proved that the poor maintenance, the dilapidated state of many buildings, turned the whole city into a ticking time bomb, as Dr. Rain put it. You didn't need the main fire front to reach you. If you had a damaged roof, the wind could deliver an ember right into your attic. Game over.
Which brings us tragically to Tuesday afternoon and St. Paul's Cathedral, the spiritual heart of the city. Everyone must have thought that was safe.
Everyone assumed it was impregnable. It was huge, made of stone. It seems like the ultimate refuge. And this leads back to our bookseller, Joshua Curtin.
Right, he stored his books there.
He and pretty much every other bookseller and printer in London rushed their stock into St. Paul's. We're talking thousands upon thousands of books, stacks of paper, valuable prints, all highly flammable packed into the crypt, the underground chapel beneath the main cathedral floor. They thought the massive stone structure above would protect it.
A logical assumption, maybe, but fatally flawed. Why?
Two main reasons. First, the exterior. St. Paul's was actually undergoing major restoration work at the time, led by a young Christopher Wren, ironically. This meant the whole upper part of the cathedral was covered in wooden scaffolding.
Oh, no.
Yeah. That scaffolding caught fire from the embers landing. It acted like a giant cage of fuel surrounding the upper stonework, heating intensely.
And a second reason,
sheer, unbelievable heat. The fire burning outside and on the scaffolding became so intense that eventually the cathedral roof, which was made of lead laid over massive timber beams, caught fire and collapsed inward. Huge burning timbers and massy stones, as one account puts it, fell through the floor of the cathedral, crashing down into the crypt below.
Straight onto Curtin's books.
Straight into thousands of pounds worth of books and paper. Crushed, then instantly ignited. His entire livelihood, everything he owned, gone in minutes.
And the evidence for this intense heat is solid.
Absolutely. Archaeologists from the Museum of London excavating the ruins later found clear proof. They found bricks fused together by melted mortar, indicating temperatures around 250, 300 degrees Celsius just from residual heat. They found iron barrel hoops that had buckled and distorted that takes around 700 degrees Celsius.
Wow.
And the most dramatic finding, iron padlock that had not just warped but actually melted. Iron starts to melt at over 1,000 degrees Celsius, maybe even higher depending on the alloy.
1,000 degrees Celsius.
Right.
Inside a stone building.
Yes. The test confirmed the fire was hot enough and sustained enough to literally devour St. Paul's, this massive stone icon. It wasn't just wood burning anymore. The stone itself was cracking, calcifying, collapsing under the thermal stress.
And the atmosphere around it. You mentioned something about the weather.
Yeah, it's incredible. The heat rising for the burning cathedral and the city around it was so phenomenal that it actually created its own localized weather system. Eyewitnesses reported a thunderstorm forming directly over the blaze, with lightning striking the burning building.
A firestorm generating a real thunderstorm.
Exactly. And the lead from the cathedral roof, it melted and poured off the building, flowing down Ludgate Hill towards the River Fleet, like a stream of molten silver, as one person. It's an apocalyptic scene.
Amidst all this, what was happening to the people, the psychological impact?
Complete breakdown for many. Panic turned into something worse. One witness described it as a frenzy of mad people just running aimlessly, shrieking like distracted creatures, completely overwhelmed.
There's a term for that now, isn't there? Cognitive paralysis.
That's a good modern way to put it. The sheer scale of the disaster just shuts down rational thought. There's that really poignant, sad story of the 80-year-old watchmaker.
What happened?
He just refused to leave his shop as the flames approached. Maybe denial, maybe just unable to process leaving his whole life behind. His skeletal remains were found later in the ashes of his shop, clutching his key, almost like they were a comfort object in his final moments.
It's heartbreaking. And with the chaos, did law and order break down?
Completely. With the authorities overwhelmed, looting became widespread. Not necessarily organized crime, but desperate or opportunistic people grabbing whatever they could from abandoned shops, food, tobacco, brandy, anything.
How did the authorities handle that later? Mass arrest?
They couldn't. The penalty for stealing anything worth more than a shilling back then was death by hanging. They would have had to execute half of London.
Right.
So they came up with this rather pragmatic, slightly strange solution. They issued a proclamation after the fire, basically asking anyone who had found goods during the chaos to just discreetly drop them off in a designated area like Finsbury Fields, north of the city. No questions asked. They were hoping to recover some property without resorting to mass execution.
A sort of amnesty for looters. And Sybil Tame, our shoemaker, where was she in all this? Her workshop was further west, right?
Yeah, Crease's hospital was toward the western edge of the main fire zone. She probably felt relatively safe for the first couple of days, seeing the fire mostly raging to the east and center.
But the embers.
She was just desperately unlucky. Even as the main fire was starting to be contained elsewhere on Wednesday, those wind-driven embers, carried on the gale, found their way to Christ's Hospital. Her workshop, her home, her tools, everything she needed to survive caught fire. It was among the last areas to burn, but it burned nonetheless, just snatched away at the last.
So even being on the edge wasn't safe? What a devastating blow.
So finally, by Wednesday, day 4, they start to get a grip on it. How do they actually stop?
It came down to learning a really hard lesson about firebreak. They'd been using these long poles with hooks, fire hooks, to pull down houses, trying to create gaps.
Right, seemed logical.
But it wasn't working well enough. They finally realized the mistake. They were pulling the houses down, but just leaving the timber and debris in a pile on the ground.
Creating a new pile of fuel for the fire to cross.
Exact. The turning point was when they got organized. Pull down the houses and immediately have teams cart away the rubble, clear the ground completely, create a true empty fire break. It took days of chaos to figure that out, but that coordinated effort finally started working.
Wasn't there a really drastic measure taken near the Tower of London?
Oh, absolutely. The tower was a huge point of, not just because it was a royal fortress and held the crown jewels, but because it stored the kingdom's main supply of gunpowder.
How much gunpowder?
Around 9,000 barrels. If the fire reached that, the explosion would have been unimaginable. It would have leveled a huge part of whatever was left of the city. So what did they do? They couldn't just pull houses down fast enough.
They used gunpowder to save the gunpowder. Sounds crazy, but sailors from the naval yards were brought in. They strategically placed barrels of gunpowder in the houses between the approaching fire and the tower and detonated them,
creating instant, massive fire breaks by demolition.
Exact. Controlled explosions to create a wide, leveled, scorched earth gap that the fire simply couldn't jump. It was drastic, but it worked. It saved the tower and prevented an even worse catastrophe.
Incredible. So better fire breaks, the gunpowder tactic. Anything else help?
Yes. The biggest help of all, probably. Around 4.0 TM on Wednesday, after 4 long days, the ferocious easterly gale finally dropped. The wind died down. And suddenly, the fire lost its terrifying speed and intensity. Robbed of the wind driving it forward and showering embers everywhere, it slowed dramatically, mostly just consuming the debris it had already created. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned.
So the immediate danger passes. The city is smoldering ruins. What about the human cost? The death toll? You hear wildly different numbers.
This is one of the biggest controversies surrounding the fire. The official records, compiled shortly afterwards, list an astonishingly low number of deaths. Just 6, maybe 8, depending on the source.
States after all that, 13,000 houses destroyed, St. Paul's collapsing, flashovers. It just sounds
ludicrous. It seems absolutely ludicrous on the face of it. How could so few people have died in such an inferno?
So why the low number? Was it a cover-up?
Probably not an intentional cover-up. Part of the problem was simply the breakdown of administration during the chaos. The people who compiled the bills of mortality, the weekly lists of deaths, and their often gruesome causes, like scalded in a brewer's mash vat or died of the plague. Their printing presses burned down, their records were lost, they fled like everyone else. There's just a gap in the official data right when the fire was raging.
Okay, so records were lost, but surely people would have noticed if thousands died.
That's the argument made by some historians, like Vanessa Harding. She argues that 17th century society, while different, was still interconnected. If thousands had perished, especially from established families or parishes, there would likely be more mention of it in letters, diaries, church records later on. Mass death tends to leave a social echo, and she argues that echo is largely missing.
Okay, that's one view. What's the counter-argument? How could thousands have died without leaving much trace?
The counter-argument, most strongly put forward by historian Neil Hansen, goes back to the sheer heat of the fire. Remember those 1,000-degree-plus temperatures we talked about?
Yeah, melting iron padlocks in St. Paul.
Right. Hansen's theory is based on the science of cremation. To cremate a human body effectively, you need sustained temperatures of around 750 degrees Celsius or more for over an hour. That reduces a body mostly to ash, a couple of pounds of gray dust, and a few fragments of bone, as he puts it.
And the Great Fire was hotter than that.
Exactly. In the hottest parts of the fire, especially in the densely packed alleyways and slums where houses collapsed inwards, creating furnace-like conditions, the heat was certainly high enough and lasted long enough for cremation to occur.
So who would these victims be?
Hansen suggests it would primarily be the poor, the sick, the elderly, maybe infants, people living in those crowded, flammable tenements who couldn't get out quickly, who were perhaps trapped by the gridlock or overcome by smoke in basements or attics. Their bodies could have been reduced to almost nothing.
And because they were poor or marginal,
their deaths might not have been recorded, even if the system was working. They might not have had strong family connections or parish ties to note their absence. They could have literally vanished in the heat, leaving almost no physical or social trace. So was it 6 deaths? Or was it hundreds, maybe thousands, effectively cremated and uncounted? We'll likely never know for sure.
It's a chilling thought. Okay, so whether 6 or thousands died, you definitely had a massive number of survivors who lost everything. What happened to them?
A huge refugee crisis. Estimates suggest around 100,000 people were made homeless almost overnight. They flooded out of the smoldering city into the open fields to the north and west, places like Moorfields, Finsbury Fields, up towards Parliament Hill. Vast impromptu camps sprang up.
How did they survive? Food? Shelter?
Shelter was makeshift tents if they were lucky, or just sleeping rough. The government did try to organize food relief. They set up temporary markets where farmers could bring produce in from the countryside, and they tried to distribute emergency rations.
What kind of rations?
This is where we get that slightly amusing story about the ship's biscuits. The military had stores of these incredibly hard, dry biscuits, basically flour, water, salt, baked solid, to last for months at sea. They tried handing these out.
How did that go down with starving Londoners?
They hated them. Apparently they were rock hard, almost impossible to eat. And because it was early September, the harvest was just coming in from the surrounding countryside. Fresh bread, cheese, vegetables were starting to arrive at the temporary market. So the starving refugees actually turned their noses up at the horrible military biscuits and held out for the fresh food. A little glimmer of resilience, maybe?
Definitely shows priority. What about financial help?
King Charles II issued a proclamation, basically a nationwide appeal, asking every parish in England and Wales to collect money for a relief fund for London.
Did it work? How much did they raise?
They did raise money, but the response really highlighted the economic geography of the king. Wealthy counties like Yorkshire contributed a lot, maybe £1,200, which was a huge sum then. Devon gave £1,500. The entire country of Wales contributed just £33.
£33 from all of Wales.
Yep. It starkly shows where the money and perhaps the royal focus lay. The burden of relief fell very uneven.
So let's check back in with our 3 Londoners. How did they fare in this aftermath? Joshua Curtin, the bookseller.
utterly ruined. Losing his entire stock in the St. Paul's crypt destroyed him financially. There was no insurance, no way to recoup that kind of loss. The records show he died completely penniless not long after, a direct casualty of the fire's economic destruction.
Tragic. What about Sybil Tame, the shoemaker who lost her workshop at the last minute?
Sybil Tame is a fantastic story of resilience, actually. She lost her tools and home, yes, but she somehow survived those initial desperate weeks. And then she did something quite enterprising. She petitioned the governors of Christ's Hospital, where her workshop had been, for permission to set up a little stall.
Selling shoes again?
No, selling liquor. She basically opened a tiny ale stall or brandy shop on the ground.
From shoemaker to public.
Exactly. She clearly had some hustle. We know about this because there are later records complaining about her. Apparently, she got into trouble for allegedly serving too much drink to a Cambridge scholar who was visiting. So she was maybe a bit too successful.
That's amazing. Is there any physical trace of her left?
Incredibly, yes. One of the few tangible links we have to an ordinary working person who survived is her trade token. These were little copper coins merchants sometimes issued. Hers has her name, Sybil Tame, and a little picture of a shoe, her logo, essentially. Right. It's now in a museum. A tiny object, but it proves she survived and got back on her feet, in a manner of speaking.
A copper token representing survival? Okay. And Robert Farriner, the wealthy banker who smartly sent his cash to win. He must have been
Farriner. His story is the most ironic and perhaps the most telling of them all. He did survive the fire financially intact. His caution paid off. His house was gone, but his gold, jewels, and papers were safe with the king.
So what went wrong?
His relationship with the king. Farriner had lent enormous sums of money to Charles II over the years. We're talking the equivalent of maybe 30 million pounds today. He was the king's principal creditor.
Okay.
After the fire, the king was facing astronomical costs, paying for the war with the Dutch, his own lavish lifestyle, and now the enormous bill for rebuilding London. He needed money badly.
So he leaned on Farriner for more.
Worse, he solved his cash flow problem with a single brutal stroke of royal power. In 1672, in an event known as the Stop of the Exchequer, Charles II simply canceled his debts. He defaulted on the massive loans owed to Farriner and other goldsmith bankers.
He just refused to pay back the 30 million pounds.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
He suspended repayments indefinitely. For Farriner, it was catastrophic. His entire business was built on that royal credit. The king's default instantly bankrupted him.
So the fire didn't ruin him, the king.
Precisely. The cautious banker who outsmarted the flame was ultimately destroyed by the political and financial decisions of the monarchy trust. Robert Farriner died penniless. A staggering fall from grace, driven by royal expedient.
That's quite a lesson. So the city rebuilds. Did they learn anything architecturally?
Oh, yes. The rebuilding was remarkably quick, but it followed strict new rules. The Rebuilding Act was passed. No more timber-framed houses allowed in the city center. All new houses had to be brick or stone.
No more jettying.
Jettying was banned outright. Streets were widened. Wooden window frames were restricted. They were absolutely determined not to let this happen again. The fire directly shaped the look of Georgian London, flatter-fronted, brick-built, less flammable.
And other innovations came out of it.
Yes, you see the beginnings of the modern insurance. An entrepreneur named Nicholas Barbin, who was actually a doctor originally, saw an opportunity in the widespread fear. He started London's first proper fire insurance company, the Fire Office, in 1680. People paid a premium, and his company promised to pay for rebuilding if their house burned down. He literally capitalized on the catastrophe.
Turning fear into profit. And the monument, that tall column near London Bridge.
That was built specifically to commemorate the fire, designed by Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke. It stands near Pudding Lane. And there's a clever piece of design symbolism in its height.
What's that?
It's 202 feet tall. If you were to lay the monument down on its side, pointing westwards, the top of it would land precisely on the spot in Pudding Lane where Thomas Farriner's bakery oven stood, where the fire began.
A permanent physical pointer to the origin.
Exactly. A constant reminder built into the cityscape.
And just one final, slightly bizarre foot, the bakers.
Ah, yes. In 1986, a full 320 years after the fire, the Worshipful Company of Bake, the official guild for London bakers, issued a formal apology for the Great Fire, accepting responsibility on behalf of Thomas Farriner.
320 years too late. Better late than never,
I suppose. A very belated apology for burning down the city. Hashtag TAC outro.
So wrapping this all up, what an incredible story. We've seen this perfect storm, haven't we? The dry weather, the medieval buildings, the negligence, and just the raw power of a fire hitting those unbelievable temperatures.
Yeah, over 1,000 degrees Celsius. But it's the human stories, isn't it? You feel that connection through things like Sybil Tame's little copper token, or just imagining standing in the scorched crypt of St. Paul's. The resilience, the loss.
Absolutely. But thinking about Robert Farriner, there's a really provocative final thought here, isn't there?
I think so. The fire itself was devastating.
Yeah.
But it also revealed something deeper, maybe more disturbing, about where power really lay and the trustworthiness of the system. Well, think about it. The wealthiest man in England, Robert Viner, survives the flames through caution and connect, but he's ultimately ruined anyway, not by fire, but by politics, by his own king defaulting on a massive debt, essentially sacrificing his banker to solve the crown's financial problem.
While the relief fund is asking poor parishes in Wales for pennies.
Exactly. So what does that tell you about the foundations of an economy or a society when the recovery is partly funded by the poor, while one of the richest individuals is destroyed by a political decision at the very top?
It suggests the rules didn't apply.
It suggests that even if you survive the Inferno, even if you rebuild your house with brick, according to the new rule, the very ground beneath your feet, the financial and political system you rely on, can still crumble if those in power decide it should. Maybe the biggest lesson from the Great Fire wasn't just about fire safety, it was about the fragility of trust, especially trust in power. That realization, perhaps, was the firebreak that truly reshaped Britain in the long run.
A powerful thought to end on. Thank you for that deep dive.